We don't want to see that go away. I mean, it saves, countless lives, and that needs to stay. I do think that we need to see maybe some new generation.
Chuck Norris is gone, and the whole world is grieving, but his wife Gina has stayed quiet, watching every tribute and every headline. And now she is finally ready to speak, and what she says is something nobody expected. What did the world get wrong about Chuck Norris? And what was he really like behind closed doors? The silence after the storm. When the news broke on March 19th, 2026, the world stopped. The way it only stops for people who have meant something real to millions. People whose presence has been so constant and so solid that their absence creates a gap where something permanent used to be, and the grief that followed was immediate and enormous. Tributes came from everywhere, from Hollywood, from the martial arts world, from military communities, from politicians and athletes and ordinary fans who had grown up watching Chuck Norris be the thing that seemed impossible to defeat. And the weight of all that tribute spoke to how deeply he had embedded himself into a certain idea of strength and resilience that people had been drawing on for decades. Yet, for those paying close enough attention, the announcement did not arrive in a complete vacuum because there had been something earlier, quieter, less reported, the kind of detail that surfaces briefly and then disappears into the noise without ever receiving the examination it deserved. A hospitalization in the months before his death that was acknowledged in only the briefest terms before the subject was quietly closed. No diagnosis was shared publicly, no timeline was offered, no follow-up reporting filled in the gaps, which is unusual given the level of public interest in someone of Chuck's magnitude, because when someone that famous receives medical attention, the media appetite for detail is typically insatiable. Yet in this case, the silence that followed was swift and complete. Then came the birthday footage, Chuck sparring with a trainer just days before his death, looking strong and sharp, and every bit the physical icon the world had always known, which now sits in the memory with a different quality against the knowledge of what came just days later. The family statement was warm, careful, and almost entirely without detail, closing every door that might have led to further questions, and that combination left a gap where a complete story should have been. Was this really as sudden as we were told? And what exactly happened in those final months that nobody fully explained? The interview. No one expected. When Gina O'Kelly finally agreed to speak, nobody knew what to expect, because the world had never really seen this side of her before. She had spent years standing quietly beside one of the most famous men on the planet without ever making herself the center of attention. And after Chuck died, she went silent the way private people do, in a way that asked for nothing and explained nothing, and simply existed as the grief of a woman who had lost her husband. She was not the type to give interviews, not the type to use the media to shape how people saw her or her family. And so when word spread that she had agreed to sit down and talk, people paid attention because this was not something she did often, and the fact that she was doing it now, so soon after losing Chuck, meant that she had something she needed to say. When the interview started, the first thing people noticed was her tone. She was calm, not cold, not distant, just calm. The way someone is calm when they have spent a lot of time thinking about what they want to say and have finally made peace with saying it. And that calmness made everything she said feel more serious, more real, more worth listening to carefully. She was not there to perform grief. She was not there to tell the world how perfect her husband was. She was there to talk about who Chuck Norris actually was, the real version, the one she had lived with every day. And from the very first few minutes, it was clear that her version was bigger and more complicated and more human than the one the world had been given. She talked about his battles early on, and when she used that word, she did not mean the fights on screen. She meant the quiet, private struggles of a man who demanded everything from himself every single day, who held himself to a standard so high that most people would have collapsed under the weight of it, and who carried all of that without ever letting it show in public. His hardest fights, she said, were never the ones that made it into any film. They were the ones that happened at home, in the quiet spaces between the public moments, in the daily work of being a husband and a father, and a man who wanted his life to stand for something real and lasting. The world had spent decades celebrating the fighter. She was saying something different now. She was saying that the man behind the fighter was the part worth knowing. So, what exactly had the world been missing all along? the man behind the myth. For decades, the image of Chuck Norris meant one thing to the world: toughness, discipline, strength, the kind of person who could walk into any situation and handle it without flinching. And that image was so consistent and so powerful that it stopped feeling like a public persona and started feeling like simply the truth of who he was, a fact about him rather than a version of him, and most people never thought to look for anything behind it. Gina had lived behind it for years, and what she wanted people to understand was not that the image was wrong because it was not wrong, the discipline was real, and the strength was real, and the values that image represented were genuinely his, but that it was only part of the picture, and the part it left out was in many ways the most important part of all. At home, she said, he was present in a way that would surprise people who assumed that a man with a career that big must have been mostly absent from family life. He was involved and attentive and genuinely interested in his children in a way that was not occasional or performative, but steady and consistent and built into the structure of daily life. The discipline fans admired on screen existed at home too, but it felt different there. It was more personal, more directly connected to the people it touched, and it came wrapped in something that the films never quite captured: a deep sense of responsibility toward the people he loved, a feeling that building his family well was not separate from everything else he stood for, but was in fact the most important version of it. He was protective without being controlling, she said, involved without being overbearing, and he had strong ideas about what he wanted to pass on to his children that went far beyond martial arts techniques or career advice. Ideas about character and integrity and how to carry yourself when things get hard. Lessons drawn from his own life and offered with the kind of quiet consistency that leaves a mark without making a lot of noise. The father his children knew was more present, more thoughtful, and more emotionally engaged than the public image of Chuck Norris ever suggested. And Gina said this not to correct the record on his behalf, but because she believed it was true, and believed it mattered, and believed that the people who loved him deserved to know it. People had seen half of him, she said simply. The half that existed in front of cameras, the half the world had packaged into memes and movies and cultural shorthand for a certain kind of strength. The other half had been there the whole time, just never on show. Was the private Chuck Norris even greater than the legend the world thought it knew? The father behind the actor. Of everything Gina said in the interview, the things she shared about Chuck and his son, Mike, were perhaps the most personal and also the most important, because by the time she spoke those words, a different version of that story had already begun circulating, a version shaped by Mike's own interview in which the complicated pressures of growing up as Chuck Norris's son had been laid out carefully and honestly. And Gina was not there to argue with that version, but to place it inside a larger picture that changed how it felt. Chuck loved Mike, she said, and she said it in the simple, direct way that people speak when they are not trying to make a point, but simply stating something they know to be completely true. And the love she described was not the distant, hands-off love of a man too consumed by his own legend to pay attention to his children. It was specific and active, and rooted in real knowledge of who Mike was as a person. The support Chuck gave was not the kind that came from picking up a phone and calling in favors, and Gina was clear that this was a choice, not a limitation. Because Chuck believed deeply that the only success worth having was success you had earned yourself, and using his name to smooth the path for his son was something he had thought about carefully and decided against. Not because he did not care, but because he cared too much to do something he believed would ultimately hurt more than it helped. He told Mike to earn his place, Gina recalled, and the way she described it made clear that this was not a cold instruction delivered from a distance, but something said directly and personally. Father to son, coming from a man who had built everything he had from nothing, and who wanted his son to know the same feeling, the particular confidence that only comes from knowing that what you have built is genuinely yours. Behind the scenes, the mentorship was quiet and steady. Chuck watching Mike's work with real attention, talking to him honestly about the industry and about resilience and about what it actually takes to keep going in a world that pushes back hard, drawing on his own experience of being told no and finding a way forward anyway, passing on the practical wisdom of a man who had genuinely lived it. Gina described moments between them that had never been seen publicly, ordinary private moments that are the real substance of any father and son relationship. Chuck engaged and present and genuinely invested in Mike's development, not as an extension of his own legacy, but as a person in his own right whose success mattered deeply. He wanted Mike to win, she said quietly. He thought about it, and he worked at it in his own way. And he believed in his son's ability to get there. He just believed Mike needed to get there himself. Was that hard belief in earned success the greatest gift Chuck gave his son? Or did it leave a distance between them that neither man ever fully closed? The pressure of the Norris name. There is a particular kind of pressure that comes with carrying a famous name, and it is not the kind that people on the outside tend to sympathize with easily, because from the outside it looks like advantage. It looks like open doors and easy introductions and a head start that most people would consider themselves lucky to have. And in some ways, it is all of those things. But it is also something else entirely. Something heavier and more complicated that the people carrying it feel every single day in ways that are almost impossible to explain to someone who has never experienced it. Mike Norris felt that pressure from the beginning, Gina said. From the earliest point in his career, when he started trying to build something of his own in an industry that could not look at him without first looking at his father, and the challenge was not just about proving himself to other people, it was about proving something to himself, finding out what he was actually capable of in a world where the answer would always be partially obscured by the question of how much the name had helped. Hollywood is not a kind environment for that kind of search. It is an industry built on comparison and category and the quick, efficient judgment of people based on what they remind you of. And what Mike Norris reminded everyone of was his father. Thus, constantly and automatically, and without any malice, but with a consistency that made it almost impossible for him to be seen cleanly as his own person, his own talent, his own separate thing that existed independently of the legend he had been born into. Gina admitted that it was not always easy, and the admission carried weight because she said it without dressing it up, without softening it into something more comfortable. Just the plain, honest acknowledgement that the Norris name was a complicated inheritance, that the same thing that gave Mike certain opportunities also made other things harder, in ways that were real and persistent, and did not simply go away with time or success. Chuck understood this tension, she said. He had thought about it seriously, and it had informed the way he approached his support for Mike. The deliberate choice to mentor quietly rather than intervene loudly, to prepare his son for the difficulty rather than try to remove the difficulty. Because removing it was not actually possible, and pretending otherwise would have left Mike less equipped for the reality he was going to face regardless. There were moments, Gina suggested, where the weight of expectation pressed down hard, where the gap between who Mike was and who people assumed he should be, simply because of his last name, created a friction that took a real toll, and those moments were not visible to the public because the family did not air them publicly, but they were real and they shaped things in ways that lasted. The name opened rooms, she said, but it also built walls. Did the pressure of that name push Mike Norris forward, or did it cost him something he never fully got back? The Path, Dakota. In Best Shows. While the world was focused on Mike and the complicated dynamics of following a legend into the entertainment industry, another story was quietly unfolding inside the Norris family. One that received far less public attention, but that meant something deeply personal to Chuck in a way that Gina described with a warmth that was different from anything else in the interview, softer and more unguarded. The warmth of someone sharing a memory that still brings genuine joy even in the middle of grief. Dakota Norris had looked at everything his father had built in Hollywood, all the films and the fame and the cultural weight of being one of the most recognized action stars in the world, and he had made a different choice. He had turned toward the martial arts, toward the discipline and the philosophy and the way of life that had existed at the foundation of everything Chuck had achieved long before any of it became famous. And that choice had meant more to his father than almost anything else Dakota could have done. Gina described Chuck's reaction to Dakota's decision with a simplicity that landed harder than any elaborate description could have. She said he was proud, deeply and genuinely proud. And then she paused in the way people pause when a simple word is doing a lot of work. When proud does not quite cover the fullness of what she is trying to convey, but is the closest honest word available. For Chuck, martial arts was never just a career. It was never just the thing that had gotten him into films or made his name famous or given him a platform that most people could only dream of. It was something more fundamental than that. a philosophy about how to live and how to carry yourself and how to keep developing as a person long after the obvious external goals have been achieved. And seeing his son choose that path felt like seeing something essential about himself being carried forward into the next generation. Dakota was not choosing the glamour or the fame. He was not drawn to the part of his father's life that had made the magazine covers and the movie posters. He was drawn to the part that had come before all of that. The quiet daily discipline of training and learning and pushing yourself past what feels comfortable. And Chuck recognized that choice for what it was, a real understanding of what actually mattered, an understanding that not everyone who grew up around the legend had managed to reach. Gina said that Chuck saw Dakota's path as a continuation of something real, something that would outlast any film or any cultural moment. The passing on of a way of living that had shaped Chuck himself from the inside out and that he had always hoped would find its way into the people who came after him. That meant more to him, she said quietly, than any movie ever did. Was Dakota's choice the moment Chuck felt his real legacy was truly safe? The schools and the legacies. Most people who think about Chuck Norris think about the films first. The kicks and the fights and the screen presence that made him one of the defining action stars of his generation. And that association is understandable because it was the most visible part of his public life for decades. The part that reached the most people and left the most immediately recognizable impression. But Gina wanted to talk about something different. Something that had existed alongside the Hollywood career for years without ever receiving the same level of attention. Something that Chuck himself had considered more important than most of what had made him famous. The martial arts schools were not a side project. She was clear about that. They were not a business venture or a brand extension or a way of capitalizing on his celebrity by attaching his name to something profitable. They were a genuine expression of what he believed, a direct attempt to take the philosophy that had shaped his own life and make it available to people who would never have any connection to Hollywood or to the world of professional martial arts competition. Ordinary people, young people, people who needed what the discipline had to offer without having any particular path toward finding it on their own. What he taught inside those schools went far beyond technique, Gina explained. Beyond the mechanics of movement and the physical skills that are the obvious content of any martial arts program. It was about something that Chuck believed sat underneath all of the physical training and gave it its real meaning, the development of a kind of inner strength that does not announce itself loudly, but that shows up quietly and consistently when life puts pressure on a person in the ways that life inevitably does. Discipline was the foundation, the daily practice of doing what needs to be done regardless of how you feel about doing it, the building of a relationship with yourself based on reliability rather than mood. And Chuck believed that learning this through the body, through the physical experience of training consistently over time, was one of the most direct and effective ways to build it, more effective than being told about it, or reading about it, or understanding it intellectually without ever feeling it in practice. Respect was woven through everything. Respect for the art, for the teachers who had passed it on, for the other people in the room working alongside you, and Chuck saw this not as a formality or a cultural tradition to be observed without understanding, but as a genuine practice with real consequences for how a person moved through the world, beyond the walls of any training space. Character was the goal, Gina said, the actual human being that emerged on the other side of years of consistent practice. And Chuck measured the success of his schools not by the competition records of the people who trained there, but by the kind of people they became, which is a different and more demanding standard than most institutions ever set for themselves. This, she suggested, was his real life's work, the part that would last longest and reach furthest and mean most in the end. Had the world spent decades celebrating Chuck Norris for the wrong thing entirely? The truth about what mattered most. There is a moment in almost every famous person's life when the thing that made them famous stops being the most important thing to them, when the awards and the recognition and the public attention that once felt essential start to feel like furniture in a room, where something more significant is happening, and the real priorities quietly rearrange themselves into an order that the outside world rarely gets to see because it does not make for the kind of story that cameras are drawn to. Fame had never been the point for him, she said, even at the height of it. Even when his face was on every screen and his name was in every conversation, he had always related to it as a tool rather than a destination. something that gave him reach and platform and the ability to do things he cared about, rather than something that was valuable in itself. And as the years passed and the career moved into a different phase, that perspective became more pronounced rather than less. What mattered most in the end was simple, and it was the same thing it had always been underneath everything else: family, values, the question of what he was passing on to the people who would carry something of him forward after he was gone. And he thought about that question seriously, and returned to it often in his final years, in a way that Gina described as purposeful rather than sentimental, the active work of a man who wanted to be intentional about his legacy rather than simply leaving it to chance. He measured himself, she suggested, not against his film career or his martial arts achievements, or any of the external markers that the world used to assess his significance, but against the quieter question of whether the people he loved were better equipped for their lives because of him. The world had celebrated the wrong part of his life, she said softly. The most important work had always been happening somewhere else entirely. Had the world missed the most significant chapter of Chuck Norris's life completely? The final reflection. In the last years of his life, something shifted in Chuck Norris in a way that Gina described as a settling, a word she chose carefully and with obvious intention, not a slowing down or a giving up or the kind of fading that sometimes comes at the end of a long and eventful life, but a deliberate turning toward the things that had always mattered most. A conscious decision to let the noise of fame and public life recede, and to invest what remained of his energy in the places where he felt it would do the most lasting good. He was more present, she said, in the simple daily sense of that word, more available for the ordinary moments of family life that busy careers so often displace. And he seemed to find genuine satisfaction in that presence in a way that suggested he understood clearly what it was worth and was not taking it for granted the way younger, busier versions of himself might have done. His pride in his children had always been real, but in those final years it became something he expressed more openly, more directly, less filtered through the disciplined reserve that had characterized so much of his emotional life. And Gina described moments where Chuck spoke about Mike and Dakota with a warmth and a specificity that reflected genuine knowledge of who they were as people, not just as his children, but as individuals whose separate lives and separate choices he had been paying close attention to. He saw both paths, Mike's navigation of the entertainment world and Dakota's commitment to the martial arts, as valid and meaningful expressions of things he had tried to instill, different in their form but connected at the root to the same values. The same commitment to doing something real and doing it with integrity, and that connection seemed to give him a deep satisfaction that went beyond ordinary parental pride. The legacy question had resolved itself for him, Gina suggested, not into a list of achievements or a filmography or a ranking among action stars, but into something more personal and more durable, the people his children were becoming and the values they were carrying forward. The quiet continuation of something he had spent his whole life trying to build. He had made his peace, she said simply, with everything that mattered. The truth that changes everything. When Gina finished speaking, something had changed, not dramatically, not in the way that loud revelations change things, but quietly and permanently. The way things change when a missing piece finally slots into place. And the picture you have been looking at for years suddenly shows you something it never showed you before. The world had a version of Chuck Norris that it had carried for decades. Polished and consistent and built from films and interviews and the particular mythology that attaches itself to people who become cultural symbols. And that version was not wrong exactly, it was just incomplete, a partial truth presented as the whole story. The most visible layer of a man who had several layers that the cameras never reached. What Gina gave the world was the rest of it. The father who showed up consistently, the mentor who believed in earning things honestly, the man who measured his life not against box office numbers or championship records, but against the quieter question of what he was building in the people around him and whether it would last. Chuck Norris. The fighter was real. The discipline and the strength and the achievements were genuinely his, and genuinely earned. But Gina's account made clear that the fighting was never the point. It was always the vehicle, the means by which a man of deep conviction tried to say something true about how a life should be lived. The world saw a fighter, she said. His greatest fight was always building something that would last beyond him.